William Connole was a Vietnam veteran, known for his quiet routines and peaceful life in Loveland, Colorado. Marcus Thorne was a drifter, invisible to most, yet watching everyone. When their paths crossed on a warm June evening, it ended in cold-blooded murder and began a terrifying string of attacks that would paralyze an entire region in fear. This is the chilling true story of how a random glance turned fatal and how a killer nearly vanished without a trace. Loveland, Colorado, was the kind of place that people moved to when they wanted to leave chaos behind. Surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature, it felt safe, almost untouched by the noise of the outside world. Families planted roots here. Retirees, like William Connole, found comfort in the stillness. Days passed slowly, predictably. Neighbors waved to one another across picket fences. Local kids rode bikes down tree-lined streets. And on warm summer nights, the hum of sprinklers was often the loudest sound you'd hear. William Connole was so a fixture of the neighborhood. At 65, he lived alone but was far from lonely. People remembered him as friendly but reserved. He was a Vietnam War veteran, and though he didn't talk much about the past, his military service earned him respect. His small one-story home sat near a busy intersection, but his life was anything but fast-paced. William kept a small garden out back, visited the local VFW hall now and then, and had a habit of stepping out onto his porch every evening, sometimes to water the plants, sometimes to smoke a cigarette, and sometimes just to enjoy the cool air before bed. On the night of June 3rd, everything felt normal. There were no signs, no strange cars, no sense that anything was off. That evening, just after 10, William stepped outside like he always did. The porch light cast a warm yellow glow across his front yard. The street was mostly quiet, with only the occasional car passing in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then stopped. It was an ordinary night in every sense, until it wasn't. Just minutes after William stepped outside, a single, sharp sound tore through the silence. Neighbors later described it as a pop or a crack, quick and out of place. At first, many thought it might have been fireworks or a car backfiring, but it wasn't. A man walking his dog across the street was the first to see William's body, collapsed near the sidewalk. He ran to him, but it was already too late. William had been shot in the chest at close range. There were no screams, no struggle, no warning, just one shot, and a life was gone. Police arrived quickly. They cordoned off the area, setting up yellow tape around the modest yard. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the night as investigators began combing through the scene. William's front door was still open, his porch light still on. A half-finished cup of tea sat on a table inside. It was as if time had frozen in that moment, holding its breath, while the town tried to process what had happened. The community was stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen here. People didn't get murdered in Loveland, and certainly not men like William Connole, kind, quiet, and harmless. His death sent a shockwave through the town, waking something that had been dormant. Fear crept into the corners of daily life, because if someone like William could be gunned down in cold blood, anyone could. In the days following William Connole's murder, investigators worked around the clock, but every lead seemed to dry up the moment they followed it. The crime scene was unusually clean. There were no shell casings left behind, no footprints. In the dirt, no fingerprints on the porch railing or mailbox. Whoever had pulled the trigger had done so with eerie precision. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The police had dealt with tragic cases before, but this one felt different, emptier, colder. Detectives began digging into William's background. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who had interacted with him in recent months. The results were always the same. William was well-liked, quiet, and never in trouble. He didn't drink heavily, didn't have enemies, and had no known financial problems. His past was clean. His present was uneventful. It was as if the man had lived a life designed to avoid attention, and yet someone had chosen to end that life in the most violent way possible. They pulled phone records, banking activity, and even checked surveillance footage from nearby businesses. There were no suspicious calls or texts, no unusual transactions, and no one caught on camera walking toward his house. A few cameras faced the general area, but none captured the moment of the shooting. It was as if the killer had studied the neighborhood first, learning where the blind spots were. The possibility that the murder was planned began to settle in. Meanwhile, the town's sense of security began to unravel. Residents, once carefree, now locked their doors and left porch lights on through the night. Some installed cameras, others bought security systems. Rumors spread quickly and theories floated between coffee shops and neighborhood meetings. Was it a robbery gone wrong, a case of mistaken identity, or something far more sinister? But none of those theories made sense because nothing had been taken. William's wallet was still in his pocket, his watch still on his wrist, his house untouched. Nothing had been stolen, only his life. Even stranger, the bullet used was traced to a rare type of ammunition, not commonly sold in stores. It was the kind often ordered online or purchased at gun shows. That detail stood out to investigators, but without a weapon or a suspect, it didn't lead anywhere. It only confirmed what many were beginning to fear. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was deliberate, purposeful, and terrifyingly calculated. The lack of motive was the most disturbing part. Most murders could be traced to something: jealousy, rage, greed. But this one was empty of emotion, devoid of explanation. Detectives admitted privately that it was one of the most baffling cases they had ever seen, and the longer it went unsolved, the more it felt like a message, though no one could say what that message was supposed to be. In a town where nothing bad ever happened, William Connole's death became the one thing everyone was afraid to talk about, and the one thing they couldn't stop thinking about. 3 days after William Connole was shot and killed, another incident occurred that shifted the entire investigation into new territory. In the small town of Windsor, about 20 miles from Loveland, a man named John Wallace was out for an evening walk when he was struck by a bullet. The shot came from somewhere across the street without warning, just like with William. But this time the victim survived. The bullet tore through John's shoulder and missed vital organs by inches. He collapsed near a hedge and was found moments later by a passing jogger. Emergency services rushed him to the hospital where he underwent surgery and was expected to recover. News of the shooting spread fast. 2 men, both walking alone at night in quiet neighborhoods, both hit by a single bullet. Both older men with no criminal records and no apparent enemies. The similarities were too close to ignore. Investigators from Loveland and Windsor began working together, sharing evidence and timelines. When ballistics came back on the bullet removed from John Wallace's shoulder, the results confirmed their worst fear. It was fired from the same gun that had killed William Connole. Suddenly, William's death wasn't just a mystery. It was part of a pattern, a chilling, calculated pattern. Law enforcement agencies across northern Colorado were alerted. The FBI became involved, offering resources and assistance. News outlets picked up the story, warning residents to stay indoors at night. The idea of a serial shooter operating in their region turned anxiety into panic. Police cars began patrolling residential areas at night. Helicopters flew low overhead, their searchlights sweeping across rooftops and lawns. It felt like the entire region had been put on high alert. Still, there was no suspect. No one had seen anything. The man who shot John Wallace had disappeared just as suddenly as he had appeared, slipping back into the night without a trace. There were no security cameras in the area that caught a clear image, and the victim himself had only caught a glimpse of a shadow before being hit. The shooter was methodical, choosing quiet places, using darkness and silence to his advantage. This wasn't just someone lashing out in anger. It was someone who planned, who selected his victims carefully, or worse, randomly. That thought frightened investigators even more. If there was no motive, no connection between the victims, how could anyone predict who might be next? Was the shooter selecting based on appearance, location, or simply choosing at random to instill fear? Public tips poured in, but none led anywhere solid. People reported hearing gunshots, seeing suspicious vehicles, or noticing strangers in their neighborhoods. Every report was followed up, every detail logged, but each time investigators hit a wall. The shooter was either incredibly lucky or disturbingly skilled at avoiding detection. What had once been viewed as a tragic, isolated murder had now become something much bigger. The sense of randomness, the clean execution, the distance between victims, it all pointed toward a killer who was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. Weeks passed with no new incidents, but the silence only made things worse. The towns of Loveland and Windsor remained on edge, their residents held hostage by the unknown. Every walk after sunset became a calculated risk. Every unfamiliar car, parked on a quiet street, sparked nervous calls to the police. People were terrified not just of what had happened, but of what might happen next. Then, just when the investigation seemed to be growing cold, something arrived that changed everything. A plain white envelope was delivered to the Loveland Police Department. It had no return address, just a Denver postmark and a sheet of paper inside. The message was typed, short and deeply unsettling. It read, "I picked him because he looked at me. I picked the other one because he didn't. It's not about who they are. It's about what they make me feel." There was no signature. No names, no threats, just that cryptic message. It didn't make sense, and that made it even more terrifying. The randomness of it, the idea that people could be marked for death based on something as small as a glance or the absence of one, shattered any remaining illusion of safety. Forensic specialists examined the envelope and the letter. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA. The letter had been printed from a cheap inkjet printer, the kind sold anywhere. The envelope had been sealed with water, no saliva, no traceable material. Whoever sent it had gone to great lengths to avoid detection. The detail and care behind that anonymity only reinforced the sense that this wasn't impulsive behavior. It was deliberate, controlled, cold. The contents of the letter made investigators reevaluate everything. If the victims were selected, based on how they made the shooter feel, then there was no pattern to predict. There was no profile to build. The idea of motive, normally the most important piece of a murder investigation, was now irrelevant. It wasn't about revenge, money, or hatred. It was about impulse, emotion, a personal logic that only made sense to the killer. For the first time, investigators considered the possibility that the shooter might not stop. They weren't finished. They were simply waiting. For what? No one knew. But it became clear that law enforcement needed to prepare for the worst. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts, hoping to understand the mind behind the killings. Profilers suggested the killer could be a transient, someone moving between towns, observing people, and striking when something inside them snapped. The public wasn't told the full contents of the letter. Officials feared it would create mass paranoia, or worse, inspire a copycat. But rumors still leaked, and fear continued to spread. The town meetings grew tense. Children were kept indoors. Late-night shifts at local businesses saw a drop in workers. The region was living under a quiet but growing siege. And through it all, the killer remained invisible. No more attacks, no new sightings, just the haunting knowledge that someone had chosen to kill not because of who the victims were, but because of how they made him feel. 3 months had passed since the murder of William Connole, and though no new shootings had occurred, the fear hadn't faded. In fact, it had deepened. The quiet, lingering silence from the killer was more unnerving than any headline. Law enforcement remained on high alert, but the trail had gone cold. Investigators combed through every tip, revisited every scene, and ran background checks on anyone even remotely suspicious. Still, nothing. The town of Loveland had settled into a tense routine, normal on the surface, but filled with underlying dread. Then, on an early September evening, a break came from the most unlikely source, a simple traffic stop. A patrol officer in Fort Collins pulled over a man walking alone near a closed city park after dark. The man wasn't doing anything overtly wrong, but he seemed agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder. He gave vague answers when questioned and couldn't produce any form of identification. He said his name was Marcus Thorne. A quick check revealed no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. But something about him didn't sit right with the officer, especially when Marcus tried to walk away mid-conversation. He was detained for further questioning. Inside his jacket pocket, Police found a crumpled slip of paper. At first glance it seemed meaningless, a few numbers scribbled in pen, but when entered into a GPS, the numbers led to an isolated spot just outside of Loveland. A dry hill surrounded by sparse trees and no homes in sight. Detectives followed the coordinates the next morning and began to search the area. Buried under a thin layer of dirt and rocks, they uncovered a weathered duffel bag. Inside was the murder weapon, wrapped in plastic, along with a worn notebook. What was written inside would confirm their suspicions and end the months-long mystery. The notebook contained pages filled with fragmented thoughts, notes on different neighborhoods, times of day, descriptions of random people. Street names were listed, including 11th Street in Loveland and the intersection in Windsor, where the second shooting occurred. It read like the mind of someone who had been stalking the streets, watching, recording, and choosing. Some entries included dates, some had descriptions: too busy, wrong time, or chillingly looks right. One entry, dated the night of William Connole's murder, simply read, "Done." Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including the murder of William Connole and the attempted murder of John Wallace. During the interviews, he was calm, expressionless. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny anything. When asked why he did it, he only said, "They made me feel something I didn't like." Psychological evaluations later revealed no diagnosed mental illness, no history of violence, just a detached man who believed the world owed him nothing, and took pleasure in reminding it of that fact. The towns of Loveland and Windsor slowly began to recover, but things would never be quite the same. The truth was chilling, not just because of what Marcus Thorne had done, but because of how easily he had blended in. He wasn't a monster from a horror story. He was just a man, quiet and unnoticed until the night he decided to kill.